Does mark the 50th anniversary of Enoch Powell's infamous River of Blood speech, warning that Britain was under threat from mass immigration. And our political correspondent, Lewis Goodall, has spent time in Powell's former constituency of Wolverhampton to see what kind of impact the speech still has today.
The discrimination and the deprivation.
50 years ago, on the 20th of April 1968, Enoch Powell, the Tory Shadow Defence Secretary, made a speech in Birmingham.
In 15 or 20 years, on present trends, there will be in this country 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants.
It was destined to become the most infamous speech made by any British politician since the war.
As I look ahead, I am fitted with much foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the white river Tiber forming with much blood.
In it, he warned that the character of the British nation was under threat from mass Commonwealth immigration.
In this country, in 12 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
This is the story of Enoch Powell, of his rivers of blood, and how he changed British politics forever. By the late 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Commonwealth citizens had made their home in Britain, including the Jaspers, who hailed from India but settled in Wolverhampton.
This is the first passport my mum had.
Oh, wow.
When she came. It's the we've kept it.
Oh, wow. How old is she there? So
she's about 35, 36 there.
And so when did they come over?
We actually came in 1965.
It was exactly these sorts of families whom Powell had in mind when he rose to speak.
Watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
It was electric, the first time a major politician had spoken out against the establishment consensus on immigration which had held between both parties since the war. And he did so in a way designed to shock. He would, he told a friend, send a firework and light up the sky. Milkinder grew up to be mayor of Wolverhampton and remembers the impact the speech had on his community.
This is the street, when the speech by Enoch Powell was made, this is where we actually lived.
You and your family?
Yes.
Your parents and the community at the time, what did they make of it?
They were petrified, terrified, they were very nervous, they were very worried because the implication was that immigrants need to go back home, that we would be thrown out of the country. The impact it had was that my mother never ever changed her nationality because of that speech.
Why? Because she thought she would be thrown out?
Because
she needed somewhere to go home to?
Yes, and this is the house where we actually lived when the speech was made.
Much of the speech doesn't exist on tape, but it wasn't surprising that Milkinder's mother was scared. Powell was saying not only that immigration should cease, but that everything should be done to encourage her and her family to leave, and that if she didn't, the character of Britain itself as a nation would be lost. It split the country down the middle. But Powell was right that his constituents, the white working class, were largely behind him.
Meat porters of Smithfield marched in protest in support of Enoch Powell.
Dangerous, it was populist, it was playing to the worst sentiments, which were then quite widespread.
They thought this was visionary, this was long overdue, it should be implemented, this was the new Messiah. I remember saying to my agent at the time, if Enoch Powell stood for leadership of the Conservative Party today, he would sweep the board.
The institutions which not just the majority, but the vast majority wish to maintain shall be destroyed.
There are phrases in that speech which really are unwise, unpleasant, absolutely calculated to excite someone who did have racialist feelings.
Allies of Powell say this was never about racism, but about numbers.
The sheer weight of immigrants that were settling in certain areas was going to cause difficult social relations. And Powell had been a soldier in India in the Second World War. He left just before partition, and he'd seen the beginnings of communal violence between Muslims and Hindus in India. And I think he was incredibly concerned that it might happen here. This speech was delivered just over a fortnight after Martin Luther King's assassination, and America was being torn apart by racial riots.
But for his critics, this wasn't about America or India. It was about the law closer to home.
It was time to try and make the Conservative Party take an opposition stance against legislation which made it illegal to discriminate on grounds of colour, class or creed. This was not about immigrants, it was about what happens to people here. We had a small employment agency where people had to fill in a form. Time and again we'd get scrawled across these forms the word "no colours."
Powell said that he wasn't speaking on behalf of himself, but on behalf of his constituents of this place, of Wolverhampton, because he argued that their concerns weren't being listened to, that they were being suppressed by a powerful group of elites, a group of people who were trying to steal his constituents' country away from them. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because Enoch Powell was the first British modern populist. He was the midwife of the politics of identity and of betrayal.
50 years on, Powellite questions of identity politics, sovereignty and nationalism cast a long shadow.
I think we live in the age of Powell. I think if you take that speech in 1968 and you strip away the clipped academic tones and you strip away the classical allusions and the rhetorical flourishes, what you have is the manifesto for modern populism. It's the idea that speaking out against immigration is the act of a courageous and visionary statesman. It's the idea that what immigrants want is not equality, it is domination. What they want is the whip hand over the local population. It's the idea that what liberalism is about giving privileges and preferences to minority groups. And that has been the platform of populist politics ever since.
In a way, our politics run straight through Powell's rivers of blood. His arguments against the EU, elites and nationhood have become mainstream. And there are many in places like the Black Country on whose behalf he spoke then, for whom he still speaks now.
I was brought up in Wolverhampton, in the area that he used to represent, so I was brought up with that name of Enoch being constantly mentioned to me all the time. He's a hero, I think, to many people, not just white working class people.
We could resurrect him now. Do you think he might get elected if he stood around these parts?
Yeah.
He'd get elected in Dudley or in Wolverhampton?
He'd get more votes than me, for sure. Yeah, no question about it. Yeah, I think that he would do extremely well.
They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future changed beyond recognition because of immigration.
Right, okay.
What do you think of it? You think it sounds right, on the money, totally wrong?
Yeah, well, absolutely, because there's no room for anybody because of immigration. Obviously, they've come over, took a lot of schools up, took a lot of housing benefits up, and there's no room for us English residents and our children and whatnot.
Did you know about Enoch Powell?
Yeah.
What did you think of him?
I think he's a great bloke. I think, and what he said would happen.
So when he said that, when he predicted that in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man would have the whip hand over the white man,
yeah, but
man, do you
yes.
think that was right? Do you think he was right about that?
I do, yeah. I can see that coming.
On the other side of Wolverhampton, at West Park Primary, there's a very different vision of Britain on show. This school, criticised by Powell in the 60s as a place with almost no white children, is rehearsing a play which tells both his and their story and which rejects his checkered legacy.
They know what racism is, they know it's ugly, they know it's important to speak out against it. This is a thriving community with so many positive things to say about itself that it thrives off the energy that you can get from diversity. In a way, he's shot himself in the foot by saying what he said, because I think it's only motivated a lot of people in this community to prove him wrong.
It doesn't matter where you go in the world, you'll find white, black, Asian, it doesn't matter where you are, you'll find people of different skin colours.
He's wrong to be racist because everyone has the right to be treated equally, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable hearing it.
He impacted too many people's life and made so much people go from this country and move to somewhere else.
All political careers end in failure, Powell once famously observed, and it never seemed truer than for his own life. But he believed he would be vindicated by history.
Regret that you're going to be predominantly remembered for this speech when one looks at your other political achievements?
I think I shall also be remembered as an opponent of Britain's membership of the European Community. And when that has finally collapsed, I think my name will be on the roll of honour.
Powell died in 1998. He's buried here in Warwick in the church of his wartime regiment.
By almost any standards, Enoch Powell was a racist, he was a sexist. We would have no compunction today in calling him a bigot. But what he also was, what you can also say about Enoch Powell, is that he was a patriot. It's the reason he's buried here under these colours. But a patriot to what? To an idea of Britain, to a type of Britain that even by his own time was already slipping away.
Powell was a man of enormous intellectual gifts, yet he was oblivious to the ironies of that which he bequeathed us. He had wanted a debate on immigration, but for years debate was stifled by a speech he made. He feared the division of a nation, yet who or what was Britain divided by more than Enoch Powell himself?
Well, join me now to discuss the legacy of that speech 50 years on are the political commentator and broadcaster Nicholas Jones, whose family knew Enoch Powell well, and the director of the Runnymede Trust, Dr. Omar Khan. Welcome to you both. Dr. Khan, perhaps we should start by saying that whether people sympathise or not with what Enoch Powell said, he was wrong. I mean, his predictions did not come to pass.
Yeah, I think he was wrong in terms of the level of violence. There hasn't been any violence, but it's not just that we haven't seen bad things, we've seen good things. We see 17 conservative black and minority ethnic MPs. He thought that was impossible. He thought that black people could never be English, could never be British. We see black and minority ethnic cabinet members. We also see, if you look at the distribution of populations, there are no neighborhoods where there are only black and minority ethnic people. In London, there's no ward where there's more than 50% of an ethnic minority population. So, you know, the idea that there are going to be these clusters of areas where there are no English people, where there are black faces only, that just hasn't been true. The idea that we're going to be, you know, that there's going to be violence and tension inevitably following from it. The only violence and tension we have is white racists who take up his legacy and try to beat people up.
Nick, your father was a senior journalist in Wolverhampton. You're a second-generation journalist. Enoch Powell made the speech about what was happening in Wolverhampton. Do you think he gave an accurate picture of what was going to transpire?
Well, there was no doubt about it. You're quite right. First of all, that my father knew Powell extremely well and had advised him on how he should promote himself and had been forewarned. You heard in your report just a few moments ago about the prediction that the speech was going to go up like a rocket and the stars were going to stay up
your
there.
Father is going to have a fizz.
That's right. That was the very conversation. So if we look at the test from my father's point of view, he had that very difficult job as a newspaper editor of trying to provide balanced coverage. But if you get back to your question about whether he was representing, whether Powell was representing the concerns of people in Wolverhampton, and we heard in the interviews that those concerns among some people remain today. I mean, there was no doubt about it. The Express and Star, that's the newspaper, was at the time reporting that the pressure that was on for housing and for schools and for family maternity services. Now, my father believed that that was being exploited by the National National Front, and he believes that Powell fell for that National Front propaganda and used it.
With Powell over this.
Yes, of course, there was a family breakup over it. Yes, a very, very traumatic moment, and it was a very traumatic time for the local newspaper. You heard there in your film, there was Michael Heseltine's prediction that Powell could have been swept the country and become Prime Minister. Well, in Wolverhampton, of course, Powell was the hero. 90% of the letters to the local paper were in support of Enoch Powell, and there's an echo of it today with the campaign by Powell's supporters to put up a blue plaque for Enoch Powell in Wolverhampton.
Although the current MP of Wolverhampton is, of course, a black woman who was an NHS nurse. There's some irony, I think, in that. And the previous MP was a conservative Sikh gentleman. So, you know, the sort of legacy in Wolverhampton now is much more mixed. I think it's important also not just to focus on Powell alone. I mean, you heard in your excellent piece there of a family that decided not to take British citizenship because they were worried about whether or not they might be kicked out. And this same week, we're talking about Windrush generation individuals who also citizenship status is in question. And in the same year that he rose to object to the 68 Race Relations Act, which Heseltine has correctly highlighted, there was a 68 Immigration Act, which also clamped down on people based on where their grandparents were born. So it's not true that Powell has had no impact, of course, on the way in which we think about race, nationality, and identity.
And also in that clip from the interview I did with him 25 years ago, he's making the point that, you know, he thought he'd be remembered for saving Britain from the European Union. And look what's happened.
And look what's happened. And of course, that was the very point why you said I was a second-generation journalist. What had fascinated me, you see, was the degree to which Powell had understood how to use the media. And of course, what we've seen subsequently, Adam, is, and it is quite significant, isn't it, how subsequently we saw the fear of immigration. Powell was using that for political gain. We saw how that was used, for example, by UKIP, how it's been used very successfully by Nigel Farage, and we've seen even now how Donald Trump used social media and the fear of immigration as a very important weapon. So that's what I think is another of the legacies of Powell, as your report pointed out.
His supporters, of course, say he wasn't a racist, because he was a racialist, is the phrase they used, because it wasn't about black or brown people, it was just about absolute levels of people coming in from outside. Do you accept that?
Not really, if you read the speech. I mean, he has actually a bigger complaint about the future children. He's more agitated, and in fact, your piece talked about Martin Luther King, that the future black and Asian British-born population are a bigger concern for him, that they'll never be able to settle in, that they'll be confused about where they actually belong. And I think it shows that he's been absolutely wrong about the ability of black and brown British people to feel part of this country, to contribute to this country. But we still have some way to go, I think, for them to feel fully equal. And I think his legacy, unfortunately, carries on in how black and minority ethnic people feel about their Britishness, and we're seeing that this week.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. This is All Out Politics. Coming up